They say a dog is a man's best friend, but when Elias found his gentle Great Pyrenees curling his body around a shivering, injured wolf pup in the middle of a blizzard, he realized that love doesn't know the difference between a pet and a predator. The silence of the Yukon wilderness was not empty, it was heavy. It pressed against the frosted windows of the cabin like a physical weight, demanding to be let in. For 70-year-old Elias Thorne, the silence was both his oldest enemy and his only companion. It had been 3 years since his wife, Martha, had passed. 3 years since the laughter stopped echoing off the rough-hewn log walls. Now, the only sound in the cabin was the crackle of the wood stove and the rhythmic thump-thump of Buster's tail against the floorboards. Buster was a Great Pyrenees, a mountain of white fluff and gentle devotion. He was already old when Martha died, and now, he moved with the same stiff-legged slowness as Elias. They were two old relics fading away in the white vastness of the north, waiting out their final winters together. "Looks like a bad one coming, old boy," Elias muttered, peering out the window. The sky had turned a bruised purple, the color of a fresh healing wound. The spruce trees were already bending, groaning under the unseen weight of the wind. Buster didn't lift his head. He just let out a long, weary sigh, his dark eyes fixed on the fire. By nightfall, the blizzard had erased the world. The wind screamed like a banshee, shaking the cabin's foundation. Elias sat in his armchair, a book resting unread on his lap. He was thinking about the days when the cabin was full, when his son, Jacob, was young and running through the snow, and Martha was baking bread that smelled of yeast and comfort. Jacob hadn't visited in 5 years, not since the argument about selling the land. The memory was a dull ache in Elias's chest, familiar and persistent as the arthritis in his knees. Suddenly, Buster stood up. It was an abrupt, uncharacteristic movement. The big dog's ears swiveled toward the door, and a low rumble started deep in his chest. Not a growl, but a sound of concern. "What is it?" Elias asked, leaning forward. "Just the wind, Buster." "Lay down." Buster ignored him. He paced to the door, whining high and sharp. He scratched at the heavy wood, his massive paws making a desperate scraping sound. "You can't go out there," Elias scolded gently. "It's 20 below zero and dropping. You'll freeze before you reach the tree line." But Buster began to bark, loud, booming barks that demanded action. He looked at Elias, then the door, then back at Elias, his eyes wide with a frantic intelligence. Elias knew that look. It was the look Buster used to give when a sheep had wandered off the property years ago. It was the look of a guardian who knew something was wrong. With a groan of effort, Elias hauled himself up. He grabbed his heavy parka, his gloves, and the lantern. All right. But if this is just a squirrel, you and I are going to have words." The moment Elias cracked the door open, the wind tried to rip it from his hinges. Snow stung his face like shattered glass. Buster didn't hesitate. The old dog surged into the whiteout, vanishing instantly into the swirling darkness. "Buster!" "No!" Elias screamed, his voice swallowed by the storm. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his veins. He couldn't lose Buster. Buster was the last tether holding him to the earth. If the dog got lost in this blinding white chaos, he would die. Elias stepped out onto the porch, shielding the lantern with his body. He followed the faint depressions in the snow where Buster had plowed through. "Buster! Here, boy!" He trudged toward the edge of the woods, the snow already up to his shins. His breath froze in his beard. He walked for 10 minutes, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was about to turn back, to get his rifle and a rope, when he saw a dark shape beneath the shelter of a fallen cedar tree. It was Buster. The dog was lying in the snow, his body curled into a tight C shape. He wasn't moving. "Buster!" Elias choked out, falling to his knees beside the dog. "Oh God, please no." But as he reached out to touch the dog's fur, Buster lifted his head. He looked at Elias, then nudged his nose toward his belly. He was shielding something. Elias brought the lantern closer. There, tucked against the warmth of Buster's stomach, almost invisible against the snow, was a ball of wet, matted gray fur. It wasn't a dog. The ears were too large, the snout too broad even for a puppy. It was a wolf pup. It couldn't have been more than 4 weeks old. It was unconscious, its tiny body rigid with cold. Its leg was twisted at an odd angle, and there was dried blood matted on its flank. "A wolf," Elias whispered, the ancient fear of the homesteader rising in his throat. In these parts, wolves were the enemy. They took livestock. They killed dogs. They were the shadows that hunted in the night. Buster looked up at Elias and whined softly, licking the top of the pup's frozen head. "He's dead, Buster," Elias said, his voice trembling. "Come on. We have to go." Buster refused to move. He nudged the pup again, harder this time, as if trying to wake it up. Elias looked at the scene. His domestic dog, bred to guard against wolves, was using his own body heat to try and save one. The irony was thick enough to choke on. But the cold was biting through Elias's parka. He couldn't stay here. "Fine," Elias grunted. "Fine." He scooped the wolf pup up. It was light, fragile, like holding a bag of ice. Buster immediately scrambled to his feet, pressing his nose against Elias's arm to ensure the cargo was safe. They fought their way back to the cabin, the wind pushing against them every step of the way. When the door finally latched shut behind them, the silence of the room felt like a blessing. Elias laid the pup on the rug before the fire. In the light, it looked even worse. It was a skeleton in a fur coat. Ribs showing, leg broken, barely breathing. "It won't survive the night," Elias told Buster, who was pacing anxiously around the rug. "Don't get attached, old boy. It's nature." But Elias was a man who, despite his gruff exterior, had spent a lifetime caring for things. He fetched a towel and began to rub the pup's body, trying to stimulate circulation. He warmed some goat's milk on the stove and used an eyedropper to force a few drops between the pup's clenched teeth. Buster settled down right next to the pup, resting his heavy chin on his paws, watching with an intensity that unsettled Elias. "You know what this is, don't you?" Elias muttered to the dog. "This is a killer. If he lives, he grows up. And if he grows up, he'll tear your throat out." Buster thumped his tail once. He didn't care about the future. He only cared about the small, shivering life in front of him right now. The hours dragged on. Elias dozed in his chair, waking every time the fire popped. Around 3 a.m., a sound woke him fully. It was a tiny, high-pitched whimper. Elias leaned forward. The pup was moving. Its legs were twitching, creating a running motion in its sleep. And then, slowly, its eyes opened. They were blue, that deep, murky blue of all newborns before they turn gold. They were terrified eyes. The pup let out a hiss, trying to scramble backward, but its broken leg failed it. It cried out in pain. Buster moved instantly. But instead of snapping, he lowered his giant head and ran his tongue over the pup's face. One long, slobbering lick that covered the wolf's entire head. The pup froze. It blinked. It looked at the giant white beast looming over it, smelling the scent of dog and safety. Slowly, the fear seemed to drain out of the tiny creature. It leaned into Buster's fur, seeking the warmth. Elias watched, stunned. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. For the next 3 days, the storm raged, trapping them inside. It became a strange, suspended reality. Elias set the pup's leg with a splint made from a wooden spoon and gauze. He fed it warm milk and mash every 4 hours. He named the wolf Silas. It meant, of the forest, a reminder that this creature did not belong here. A reminder that this was temporary. "As soon as the snow clears, I'm taking him to the ranger station," Elias told Buster on the 4th morning. "They can deal with him. Or nature can." But as he said it, Silas hobbled across the floor on 3 legs, tripped over his own paws, and landed face first in Buster's fur. Buster groaned and rolled over, letting the wolf chew on his ear. The pup yipped, a sound that was slowly turning from a cry into a playful bark. Elias felt a crack in his armor. He watched them play, the giant white mountain and the scrawny gray shadow. He remembered how Jacob used to play with their old collie when he was a boy. He remembered the feeling of life in the house. The silence wasn't so heavy anymore. On the 5th day, the sun broke through. The sky was a blinding, polished blue. It was time. Elias knew the law. Keeping a wild animal was illegal. Dangerous. If the townspeople found out, especially the ranchers who lost cattle to wolves every winter, they would come to the door with shotguns. He packed a box. He put warm blankets in it. He picked Silas up. The wolf pup struggled, whining, reaching out with its paws toward Buster. Buster stood by the door, blocking the exit, letting out a low, mournful woof. "Move, Buster," Elias said, his voice hardening. "He belongs in the wild. Or with professionals. Not here." He pushed past the dog and stepped out into the blinding snow. The truck wouldn't start in this cold, so he would have to walk the 4 miles to the main road where the ranger patrol usually passed. He walked for a mile, the box heavy in his arms. The cold air burned his lungs. Silas had stopped struggling and was just shivering against Elias's chest. Elias stopped to catch his breath. He looked down into the box. Silas looked back. The fear was gone from those blue eyes, replaced by a confused trust. He nuzzled Elias's glove, looking for the milk dropper. Elias looked at the vast, indifferent forest. He imagined leaving this creature alone. He imagined the ranger taking it, putting it in a cage, or worse, putting it down because it was too young to survive without a mother. He thought of Martha. On her deathbed, she had made him promise something. "Don't turn into stone, Elias. The winter is hard enough without you making your heart cold too." He looked back at his tracks in the snow. And then he looked further back, toward the cabin. Standing on the porch, a tiny white speck in the distance, was Buster. Watching. Waiting. "Damn it," Elias cursed softly. "Damn it all to hell." He turned around. He didn't walk to the road. He walked back to the cabin. When he opened the door, Buster didn't jump up. He just wagged his tail, a slow, steady rhythm of approval. Elias set the box down and tipped it over. Silas tumbled out, shook himself, and immediately limped over to curl up between Buster's front paws. "Don't get used to it," Elias warned the room, taking off his coat. "He stays until the leg heals. That's it. Then he goes." But as he sat in his chair and watched the firelight dance across the sleeping forms of the dog and the wolf, Elias Thorne knew he was lying to himself. The winter had brought a ghost into his home, and for the first time in 3 years, the house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a nursery. But the world outside was cruel, and spring was a long way off. Elias didn't know then that saving the wolf was the easy part. Keeping him alive when the world found out, that would be the war. The Yukon winter did not leave quietly, it retreated with a grudge. For weeks, the cabin remained buried in a tomb of ice, the wind howling like a wounded animal. But inside, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Elias had expected the wolf pup to die. When Silas survived the first week, Elias expected him to remain wild, a snarling creature of instinct that would eventually turn on them. He was wrong on both counts. Silas grew with terrifying speed. The scrawny, broken-legged scrap of fur filled out into a creature of sleek power. By the time the first icicles began to drip from the eaves in March, Silas was no longer a pup. He was a lanky adolescent, his coat a mix of timber-smoke gray and snowy white, his eyes shifting from muddy blue to a piercing, intelligent amber. But it was his behavior that baffled Elias. Silas did not act like a dog, nor did he act like a captive wolf. He acted like Buster. Buster, the old Great Pyrenees, had appointed himself the pup's guardian, mentor, and pillow. Where Buster went, Silas followed. If Buster lay by the hearth, Silas lay by the hearth, often draping his growing body over the old dog's legs. If Buster barked at a squirrel, Silas would let out a sharp, awkward yip, trying to mimic the sound, though his vocal cords were built for howling, not barking. "You're confusing him," Elias muttered one evening, watching Silas try to wag his tail. Unlike a dog's loose, happy wag, Silas's tail was stiff, a subtle semaphore of language Elias was only beginning to understand. "He thinks he's a sheepdog, Buster. He's going to have an identity crisis when he realizes he's the one the sheepdogs are supposed to fight." Buster just thumped his tail. He seemed to possess a boundless patience for the young wolf's energy. When Silas got too rough, nipping at Buster's heels or chewing on his ears with razor-sharp puppy teeth, Buster would simply place a heavy paw on Silas's head and pin him to the floor until he calmed down. No growling, no biting. Just the calm authority of an elder. And Silas, the apex predator in the making, would submit instantly, rolling onto his back and exposing his throat in a display of total trust. But there were moments when the wild bled through. One evening, Elias was cutting up a venison steak for dinner. He tossed a raw scrap to Buster, who caught it clumsily and chewed it with loud, sloppy enjoyment. Elias tossed a second piece to Silas. Silas didn't catch it. He snatched it from the air with a speed that blurred the eye. He didn't chew immediately. He froze, his amber eyes locking onto Elias, his body tense and coiled. For a split second, the playful puppy vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating hunter protecting his kill. Then, just as quickly, the tension broke, and he swallowed the meat whole, trotting over to lick Elias's hand gently. "You're a loaded gun, aren't you?" Elias whispered, stroking the wolf's ears. "Safety is on for now, but the trigger is there." Spring arrived in a violent burst of mud and meltwater. The world turned from white to a wet, bruised brown. The roads became passable again, which meant Elias's isolation was ending. This terrified him. "We have new rules," Elias told the animals one morning. "Buster, you can go out. Silas, you stay inside. Always." Silas paced by the door, whining a low, vibrating note that rattled in his chest. He could smell the thaw, the scent of damp earth, rabbit, and pine sap. The call of the wild was screaming in his blood, but the command of the alpha, Elias, kept him grounded. Elias had to go to town for supplies. He left the radio on to mask the silence and locked the heavy oak door from the outside. The town of Whitehorse was buzzing with the energy of spring. Trucks were coated in mud. Locals were swapping stories of the winter. But as Elias loaded sacks of flour and dog food into his truck, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. "I'm telling you, it's not normal," a voice growled. It was Garrett, a cattle rancher who owned the land abutting the national forest. He was a hard man, weathered by wind and resentment, known for his quick trigger finger. "Wolves take calves, Garrett." "That's nature," another man replied. "This isn't just taking calves," Garrett spat, leaning against his pickup. "I found tracks near the creek. Big ones. Too big for a coyote, too heavy for a lone wanderer. And I found a kill site. A deer. It wasn't eaten. It was shredded. Like something was playing with it." Elias froze, a bag of kibble halfway into his truck bed. "I'm setting traps," Garrett announced, loud enough for Elias to hear. "And I'm organizing a hunt next weekend. I'm going to clear those woods out before calving season starts in earnest." Elias drove home with a lead weight in his stomach. He drove faster than usual, the truck fishtailing on the slick mud roads. When he finally pulled up to the cabin, his heart stopped. The front door was open. Splinters of wood lay on the porch. The lock hadn't been picked. The doorframe had been chewed and clawed until the latch gave way. "Buster! Silas!" Elias screamed, grabbing the rifle from his rack and running into the yard. The cabin was empty. The silence was absolute. "No, no, no," Elias panted, scanning the tree line. "Don't be out there. Not now." He ran toward the creek, following the muddy paw prints. There were two sets. One large and heavy, Buster. One slightly smaller but deeper, with the distinct, elongated toes of a wolf. He found them a mile deep in the woods, in a small clearing where the sun hit the grass. Elias raised his rifle, ready to shoot a bear, a cougar, anything threatening his family. But he lowered it slowly, his breath catching in his throat. They were playing. Silas was fully grown now, standing nearly as tall as Buster but with half the bulk. He was a blur of motion, running circles around the old dog. He would dart in, nip at Buster's tail, and dart away before Buster could turn. It was a game of tag. Buster was barking, happy, booming barks that echoed off the mountains. Silas didn't bark. He moved in silence, a ghost in the daylight. "You idiots!" Elias yelled, his relief crashing into anger. "Get over here!" Both heads snapped toward him. Buster wagged his tail, guilty but happy. Silas froze. For a moment, looking at the wolf standing in the dappled sunlight, Elias saw the creature Silas was meant to be. Majestic. Wild. Dangerous. Silas lowered his head and trotted toward Elias, his body language submissive, apologizing. But as he reached Elias, he paused. His ears swiveled toward the south, toward Garrett's ranch. Silas's hackles rose. A low, menacing growl ripped from his throat, a sound far deeper and more resonant than anything a dog could produce. "What is it?" Elias whispered. Then he heard it. The crack of a gunshot. Distant, but unmistakable. Silas bolted. Not toward the cabin, but toward the sound. "Silas, no!" Elias lunged, grabbing a handful of the wolf's thick neck fur. Silas snarled, snapping his jaws inches from Elias's hand, a reflex, before realizing who it was. He stopped, trembling with the urge to run, to hunt, to fight. "Home!" Elias commanded, his voice shaking. "Now!" It took every ounce of will Silas had, but he obeyed. He turned and ran back toward the cabin, Buster wheezing behind him. That night, Elias boarded up the door with iron brackets. He covered the windows with heavy blankets. The cabin became a fortress. "We are living on borrowed time," Elias told the room. Silas paced the floorboards, restless. The run in the woods had awakened something in him. He was no longer content to sleep by the fire. He paced the perimeter of the cabin, smelling the drafts under the door. He jumped onto the kitchen table, something he was strictly forbidden to do, to peer out the high transom window. He was watching for something. Or someone. 2 days later, the someone arrived. Elias was chopping wood in the yard, Buster dozing in a patch of sun. Silas was locked inside, pacing. A truck crunched up the driveway. It was a Green Department of Fish and Wildlife vehicle. A ranger stepped out. It wasn't a stranger. It was Sarah, a young woman who had known Martha. She looked uncomfortable. "Morning, Elias," she said, tipping her hat. "Sarah," Elias grunted, resting his axe. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I had a report," she said, glancing around the yard. "Garrett. He says he saw something chasing a deer near your property line. Says it looked like a wolf, but—" She hesitated. "He said it had a collar on." Elias's blood ran cold. He hadn't put a collar on Silas, but in the distance, Silas's ruff of lighter fur around his neck could look like one. "Garrett needs glasses," Elias said, keeping his voice steady. "You know Buster. He wanders sometimes." Sarah looked at Buster, who was currently snoring, looking like a discarded rug. "Garrett knows what a Great Pyrenees looks like, Elias. He said this was gray. Fast." She took a step closer. "Elias, you know the law. If you're harboring a wild animal, it's a danger. To you and to the animal. If it's habituated to humans, it can't be released. It has to be put down." Elias gripped the axe handle. "I don't have a wolf, Sarah. I have an old man's loneliness and a lazy dog. That's it." Sarah studied him for a long moment. She respected Elias. She didn't want to push. "Okay," she said softly. "Just be careful. Garrett is out for blood. If he sees a wolf, he shoots. No questions." She turned to leave. At that exact moment, inside the cabin, Silas saw a squirrel on the windowsill. He lunged. Crash. Silas hit the window with his full weight. The glass didn't break, but the entire cabin wall seemed to shudder. A high-pitched, frustrated yip, followed by a deep, frustrated howl, pierced the air. Sarah spun around. What was that? Elias's mind raced. "TV," he blurted out. "Watching a nature documentary. Volume stuck on high." It was a terrible lie. Sarah's eyes narrowed. She looked at the blanketed windows. She looked at the heavy iron brackets on the door. "Elias," she said warningly. "Go home, Sarah," Elias said, his voice hard. "Please." She stood there for an agonizing 10 seconds. Then she shook her head. "I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that. For Martha's sake. But you need to fix this. Whatever it is. Fix it. Before Garrett does." She drove away. Elias dropped the axe. He went inside. Silas was sitting by the door, looking proud of himself for almost catching the squirrel. Elias sank to the floor and buried his face in his hands. He was trapped. He couldn't keep Silas. He couldn't release him. And he couldn't let him be killed. But nature, as it always does, forced his hand. A week later, the moon was full, bathing the forest in silver light. Elias was asleep. Buster was asleep. Silas was awake. He heard it before the others. The snap of a twig. The heavy, shuffling gait of something massive. The scent of musk and old meat. A grizzly bear. It wasn't just passing through. It was attracted by the smell of the smoked salmon Elias had hung in the shed. Silas moved to the door, his growl low and continuous. Elias woke up instantly. What? Then he heard the crash. The shed door being ripped off its hinges. Buster woke up. His instincts kicked in. The old guardian surged to his feet, barking his deep, warning boom. He threw himself at the door, demanding to be let out to do his job. "No, Buster!" Elias yelled, scrambling out of bed. "That's a grizzly!" But Buster was in a frenzy. He was the protector. This was his territory. He clawed at the door, panicked and furious. The bear, hearing the dog, lost interest in the salmon. It turned toward the cabin. A grizzly bear can move with deceptive silence, but when it wants to destroy, it is a wrecking ball. The bear hit the front door. The iron brackets groaned. The wood cracked. Buster was barking madly at the shaking door. Elias grabbed his rifle, his hands shaking. He fumbled with the shells. Crack. The top hinge gave way. A massive paw, tipped with claws like knives, punched through the gap, swiping blindly. Buster, blind with courage and stupidity, lunged at the paw, biting it. The bear roared, a sound that shook the foundation bones of the house. It ripped the door darker. The bear pushed its head through the broken wood, eyes glowing, teeth gnashing. Elias raised the rifle, but he couldn't get a clear shot without hitting Buster. "Buster, move!" Buster didn't move. He stood his ground, barking in the face of death. The bear swiped, a backhand blow that caught Buster in the shoulder. The big dog went flying across the room, slamming into the stone hearth with a sickening thud. He didn't get up. "Buster!" Elias screamed. The bear began to squeeze its massive shoulders through the broken door. Elias racked the bolt of his rifle. But before he could pull the trigger, a gray streak launched itself from the shadows of the kitchen. Silas. He didn't bark. He didn't posture. He attacked with the silent, lethal precision of his ancestors. Silas hit the bear in the face, his jaws locking onto the grizzly's sensitive nose. The bear roared in shock and pain, rearing back, pulling Silas with it. Silas held on. He was 110 pounds of muscle and fury. He used his momentum to twist, ripping at the bear's face, blinding it with its own blood. The bear stumbled back out onto the porch, thrashing to dislodge the wolf. Silas released his grip at the last second, landing on the porch railing, then instantly lunging back in, snapping at the bear's throat. It was a dance of death. The bear was 5 times Silas's size, but Silas was faster. He was fighting not for territory, but for his pack. For the old man with the gun. For the white dog lying still by the fire. Elias scrambled to the broken door, rifle raised. He saw them in the moonlight, the massive dark shape of the bear and the silver ghost tearing at it. "Get back!" Elias shouted. The bear, confused and bleeding, decided the meal wasn't worth the fight. It swiped once more, missing Silas by an inch, and turned, crashing off into the woods. Silas stood on the porch, his chest heaving, his muzzle stained dark. He watched the bear go, making sure it was gone. Then, he threw his head back and let out a howl. It was a sound of victory, a sound of warning, a sound that carried for miles in the crisp night air. And in the silence that followed, Elias heard the terrifying echo of a truck engine starting down the road. Garrett had heard the howl. Elias dropped the rifle and ran to the hearth. Buster was breathing, but his breathing was shallow. Silas limped into the room. He had a deep gash on his flank where the bear's claw had grazed him, but he ignored it. He went straight to Buster. He licked the old dog's face, whining softly, nudging him. "Wake up. I did it. I saved us. Wake up." Buster opened one eye. He let out a weak groan and thumped his tail once. Elias slumped against the stone fireplace, one hand on Buster, one hand buried in Silas's thick bloody fur. Tears streamed down his face. "You saved us," Elias whispered to the wolf. "You saved us, and you damned yourself." The headlights of a truck swept across the front window, illuminating the broken door and the blood on the floor. Garrett was here. Elias looked at Silas. The wolf looked back, his amber eyes clear and knowing. He didn't run. He stood over Buster, facing the door, ready to fight the next monster that walked through it. But Elias knew a gun was different than a bear. "Run," Elias whispered, pushing Silas toward the back window, the one that wasn't boarded up. "Silas, run." Silas hesitated. "Go!" Elias screamed, his voice breaking. The heavy boots crunched on the gravel outside. "Elias!" Garrett's voice boomed. "I heard it. I know you have it." Silas looked at the window, then at Elias. He pressed his forehead against Elias's for one brief second, a goodbye. Then he leaped. He cleared the sill effortlessly, vanishing into the night just as Garrett kicked the broken front door wide open, shotgun in hand. "Where is it?" Garrett demanded, scanning the room. He saw the blood. He saw the broken furniture. He saw the injured dog. "Where is the wolf, Elias?" Elias looked up, his face a mask of grief and defiance. "There's no wolf here," Elias said quietly. "Just a family." But through the open window, from the ridge high above the cabin, a lonely, mournful howl rose up to the moon. Garrett smiled grimly. "Doesn't matter," he said, racking his shotgun. "I know where he is now." The silence that followed Garrett's departure was heavier than any blizzard. Elias worked with the desperate focus of a field medic. He knelt beside the hearth, his hands slick with Buster's blood, stitching the deep gash on the dog's shoulder with a needle and fishing line sterilized in vodka. It was crude, but the nearest vet was 2 hours away, and Buster wouldn't survive the drive. "Stay with me, old man," Elias murmured, his voice cracking. "You don't get to leave me. Not tonight." Buster whimpered, his tail giving a faint, erratic thump against the floor. He was in shock, but he was alive. For the next 3 days, Elias didn't sleep. He sat in the armchair with his rifle across his lap, watching the window. Every shadow that moved in the tree line looked like a wolf. Every snap of a twig sounded like a hunter's boot. The town of Whitehorse was small, and news traveled faster than the wind. The story of the bear attack morphed as it passed from mouth to mouth. In one version, Elias had fought the bear with a knife. In another, a demon wolf had torn the bear apart. But Garrett was telling a different story. He was telling anyone who would listen, at the diner, at the gas station, at the feed store, that Elias Thorne was harboring a man-eater. "It tasted blood," Garrett told the sheriff, loud enough for half the town to hear. "It attacked a grizzly. You think a toddler is safe? You think your livestock is safe?" On the 4th morning, the sheriff's cruiser pulled up to the cabin. Sheriff Miller was a good man, tired and nearing retirement, caught between the law and his neighbors. "Elias," Miller said, standing on the porch, looking at the boarded-up door. "We need to talk." Elias stepped out, closing the door behind him to hide Buster's bandaged form. "If you're here to search my house, Miller, you better have a warrant." Miller sighed, taking off his hat. "I don't want to search your house, Elias. I know the wolf isn't there. Garrett says he saw it run." He paused, looking Elias in the eye. "Garrett is organizing a posse. 10 men. Dogs. Scopes. They're going out tomorrow at dawn." Elias felt a cold stone settle in his gut. "It's a massacre, Miller. Not a hunt." "It's lawful," Miller said gently. "It's a predator control zone. I can't stop them. I'm here to tell you, keep your head down. Don't do anything stupid. Let nature take its course." "Nature!" Elias laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "There's nothing natural about 10 men with high-powered rifles hunting one animal." "It's just a wolf, Elias," Miller said softly. "I know you're lonely out here. I know you miss Martha. But don't confuse an animal with a friend." Elias didn't answer. He just turned and walked back inside. That night, Elias made a decision. He packed a bag. Water, dried meat, a first-aid kit. He looked at Buster, who was sleeping heavily, the fever finally breaking. "You stay here, guard the fort," Elias whispered, kissing the dog's broad head. He didn't take his rifle. He took his walking stick. He stepped into the darkness. He didn't know where Silas was, but he knew where he would go. There was a ridge 3 miles north, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley. It was where Elias used to take Jacob camping when he was a boy. It was high ground. Safe ground. Elias moved through the forest like a ghost, his joints aching, his breath misting in the cold air. He walked for hours, stopping every few minutes to listen. The forest was silent. Too silent. Just before dawn, he reached the base of the ridge. The sky was turning a bruised purple. And then he saw them. Flashlights cutting through the trees to the east. The sound of baying hounds. Garrett's posse had started early. Panic seized Elias. They were downwind. The dogs had the scent. They were tracking Silas not to the north, but toward the box canyon near the river, a dead end. "No!" Elias gasped. He pushed himself harder, scrambling over fallen logs, ignoring the burning in his lungs. He had to cut them off. He reached the edge of the canyon just as the sun broke the horizon, painting the snow in blinding gold. The canyon was a narrow gorge with steep limestone walls. At the far end, trapped against a sheer drop, stood Silas. The wolf looked magnificent and terrifying. He was pacing back and forth, his fur bristling, his amber eyes scanning the rim of the canyon. He was cornered. And below, emerging from the tree line, came the hunters. "There he is!" Garrett's voice shouted. Elias stood on the ridge, looking down. He was 200 yards away. He saw Garrett kneel, resting his rifle on a stump. He saw the other men fanning out. Silas stopped pacing. He turned to face the men. He didn't cower. He stood tall, chest out, a king facing an execution squad. "Don't shoot!" Elias screamed. He scrambled down the loose shale of the slope, sliding, falling, tearing his hands on the rocks. The men looked up. Garrett didn't lower his rifle. "Elias, get out of the way!" Garrett yelled. "He's mine!" Elias hit the canyon floor and ran. He ran faster than he had in 20 years. He ran until he was standing between the line of rifles and the wolf. He stood 10 feet in front of Silas, arms spread wide, gasping for air. "Elias, are you crazy?" Miller's voice called out from the back of the group. The sheriff had joined them, trying to keep order. "You want him." Elias wheezed, staring down the barrel of Garrett's gun. "You go through me." "He's a killer, Elias." Garrett spat, his finger tightening on the trigger. "He almost killed your dog." "He saved my dog." Elias roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "He fought a grizzly bear to save my dog." "He saved me." The men murmured. They lowered their guns slightly. This wasn't the story they had been told. "He's a wolf," Garrett said, his voice shaking with adrenaline and rage. "He belongs on a wall." "He belongs to the wild," Elias said. "And he's leaving. Right now." Elias turned his back on the guns. It was the most dangerous thing he had ever done. He faced Silas. The wolf was trembling. His muzzle was wrinkled in a snarl, his eyes darting from Elias to the men. He was ready to launch himself at them, to die fighting. Elias locked eyes with him. He softened his posture. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old leather glove he used to play tug-of-war with. It smelled like home. Like Buster. "Go," Elias whispered. He pointed toward a narrow, treacherous goat path that wound up the far cliff face, a path a man couldn't climb, but a wolf could. Silas looked at the glove. He looked at Elias. The snarl vanished. For a heartbeat, the amber eyes held a depth of sorrow and understanding that no human could dismiss as mere instinct. "Go, Silas," Elias said, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Run." Silas stepped forward and pressed his wet nose against Elias's hand one last time. Then he turned. He hit the cliff face like a lightning bolt, scrambling up the sheer rock, finding footholds where there were none. "He's getting away," Garrett shouted, raising his rifle again. "No." Elias didn't move. He stayed directly in the line of fire. Bang! A single shot rang out. Elias flinched. But the bullet struck the rock face 10 feet below Silas, sending up a cloud of dust. Garrett had missed. Or maybe, looking at the old man protecting the beast, he had missed on purpose. Silas reached the rim of the canyon. He paused, silhouetted against the morning sun. He looked down at Elias one last time. Then he threw his head back and let out a howl, not of mourning but of freedom. And then he was gone. Elias sank to his knees in the snow, his strength finally leaving him. The drive back to the cabin was silent. Sheriff Miller drove Elias home. Garrett had driven off without a word, his pride bruised but his humanity perhaps slightly restored. When they pulled up to the cabin, there was a strange car in the driveway. A dusty sedan with out-of-state plates. Elias frowned. "Who is that?" He walked up the steps, his legs feeling like lead. The door opened before he could touch the handle. A young man stood there. He had Elias's nose and Martha's eyes. He looked tired, worn down by city life and unspoken regrets. "Dad." It was Jacob. Elias stood frozen. "Jacob." "I saw the news," Jacob said, his voice thick. "About the bear. The wolf. I thought you were dead." Elias looked at his son. He saw the hesitation, the fear of rejection that mirrored his own. "I'm not dead," Elias rasped. "Not yet." Jacob stepped onto the porch. "I read Mom's letters," he said quietly. "The ones she wrote before the end. She said you were drowning in this place. I should have come sooner." Elias looked past his son, into the cabin. Buster was awake, lifting his head, thumping his tail at the new arrival. Elias looked back at Jacob. The anger he had held onto for 5 years, the anger about the land, the funeral, the silence, felt suddenly heavy and useless. It was a burden he didn't want to carry anymore. "You're here now," Elias said. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his son. Jacob stiffened for a second, then crumbled, hugging his father back with a desperate strength. They stood there on the porch, two broken men holding each other up, while the ghost of a wolf watched from the safety of the trees. Epilogue. 1 year later. The winter garden was in bloom, defying the frost. Snowdrops and crocuses pushed through the white blanket, purple and white flags of life. Elias sat on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hand. Buster lay at his feet. The dog walked with a permanent limp now, and his muzzle was entirely white, but he was happy. Jacob was inside, fixing the kitchen sink, humming a tune Martha used to sing. Jacob had stayed. He had turned the old shed into a woodworking shop. The sound of a saw and human voices had chased the silence away for good. "Dad," Jacob called out. "Coffee's ready." "In a minute," Elias replied. He was watching the ridge. He did this every morning, a ritual. Most days, there was nothing but pine and sky. But today was different. On the crest of the hill, where the forest met the blue, a shape appeared. Gray. Regal. Huge. Silas. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a sleek, silver female. And tumbling around their feet were 3 clumsy, dark-furred pups. Elias's breath caught in his throat. Silas sat down, his tail wrapping around his paws. He looked down at the cabin, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the old dog on the porch, at the man who had saved him. He didn't howl. He didn't come closer. He simply sat there for a long minute, allowing Elias to see. "I am here. I am whole. I am home." Elias lifted his coffee mug in a silent toast. "Thank you," he whispered across the distance. Silas dipped his head once, a bow of respect. Then he turned to his mate, nudged her gently, and together the pack vanished back into the wild, leaving the man and his son to the warmth of their own fire. Elias smiled, took a sip of coffee, and finally, for the first time in many years, turned his back on the woods and went inside.